Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today is day 3 of teaser season for patch 3.24 and the upcoming Necropolis expansion. Today we're going to be talking about 3 things, and actually only one of them relates to the Necropolis expansion. Firstly, we've got some changes that are being made to spamming of Jeweler's Orbs and Fusing Orbs. Secondly, we've got patch 3.23.2, which went live today. And finally, I want to talk about the interview that Jonathan Rogers from Path of Exile 2 did with Preach Gaming, who's a streamer. There'll be a bit more that we'll come to on that later. But let's start with the news item of a quality of life upgrade. Now, I do think that what we might be seeing here from Grinding Your Games is a strategy of revealing quality of life changes during the first week of teaser season. Then during the second week, they might then shift over to things that impact character builds. Of course, we'll have to see on that. I don't have any more information than you do. Let's watch this video that they posted. This showcases how you can control and left click in order to spam apply fusings to a bow. And you'll see this Superior Death Bow here is going to be 6 linked in 56 fusing orbs, which is pretty lucky. And that's going to be done via just simply holding control and left click on it. And that spams all those fusings until boom, we end up getting the lucky one. Now, this is a pretty good quality of life upgrade, but I don't think it's quite flawless. The reason for that is that it's quite common, especially early in progression in a league, that you don't want to roll over a 5 link. There's certainly exceptions to this, but if you're playing in Trade League, generally speaking, you want to 6 socket an item, then start applying fusings to it, and if you hit 5 link first, you sell it, you buy a new copy of the item, and you start over. If you hit 6 link first, fantastic, you use it. Or alternately, if you hit the 5 link first and you don't want to sell it, you can then corrupt it either using a Vaal Orb or using a 30 quality Corruption Beast, and then after you've done that, you then apply Tainted Fusings to it for a reasonable chance to end up with a 6 link that way. In short, I think that this system would be better if there was a way to have it stop on a 5 link as well, and I think the best way to do that would be to have a UI setting that defaults to off, and that UI setting is simply do not roll over a 5 link. People could then turn that off once they feel they've got a forever chest they're not going to upgrade past, but for early in progression, you would definitely keep that on. I also timed how long it takes to apply each fusing orb, and it appears to me that it may be 4 server ticks or 132 milliseconds, which would then mean that it is 7.5 fusing orbs per second that's being applied. Now, the second piece of news today was the launch of patch 3.23.2. This is already live, and most of it is not particularly important, but there's a couple of things that matter. Firstly, if you have a slow internet connection, then you're going to want to download this in advance because it's about 3.8 gigabytes on the standalone client. I have no idea how big it is on Steam, but presumably slightly larger. So definitely get onto that if that is not a 3-minute job on your PC. The second thing that's worth noting here is the next time that you log into the game client, it's going to run a cache cleanup. This is another thing you want to get out of the way sooner rather than later. So even if you've completely finished everything you want to do in the Affliction League and you're not someone that cares about Standard, it is still worth logging into the game once, and that will run a little bit of a cleanup within the game client. All of your cached minimaps, they'll get deleted. Now this can be left until patch 3.24 goes live, but if you wait till 3.24, it'll mean it just takes a little bit longer the first time you load the game after 3.24. So may as well get that one out of the way now. The cleanup that they do here should have a negligible impact on performance for people who run up to maybe 1,000 maps. If you run 1 to 5,000 maps, it should be a modest improvement in performance. And if you run truly massive amounts of maps, like 5,000 or more, then this should be a huge improvement in performance for your PC specifically. The final thing you may want to pay attention to here is that there have been changes to the pool of items in the Voidborn Reliquary. There's 1,070 new ones that have been added. Now, I don't know whether these new ones are going to bias towards better uniques like Mageblood, or whether they're going to bias towards weaker uniques like Wings of Entropy. Time will tell on that, but it does mean that any past predictions that you might have made about the value of Voidborn Reliquary keys into the next league are going to end up being slightly wrong. So finally, let's move on to the Path of Exile 2 information, and this is the Preach Gaming interview with Jonathan Rogers. This is really worth watching in its entirety, and I'll put a link down in the description of this video below to Preach's Twitch channel. Now, Preach is also going to post this to his YouTube account, so you'll be able to have a look at it there. If you don't know who Preach is, he's someone who was originally known as a quite competitive World of Warcraft raider and streamer. But since he became more and more disenfranchised with the direction Blizzard was going, he started exploring out into different games. And he's someone who's played a very large amount of different games at a fairly high level, and has quite interesting insights about game design in general. He's one of the few streamers that I find quite entertaining to watch, even if I don't know the game that he's playing. On top of that, he's someone who has played Path of Exile up to what you might term the middle of endgame. So he hasn't pushed into true endgame bosses as yet, but he has done most of the Atlas. So this means it'll have quite different insights and represent a different section of the player base to those of us that can complete the entire Atlas in 24 hours played. Anyways, Preacher's interview with Jonathan touched on a lot of things, but mostly with a focus on Path of Exile 2. I only wanted to go through a small subset of that here in this video, but if you do want to watch the whole thing, I highly recommend it. One of the things that was quite interesting was that when WASD movement was announced as an option in Path of Exile 2 internally inside Grinding Gear Games, a lot of people were like, I can't see myself ever using that except maybe on specific skills. And apparently throughout the time that people have been able to experience it there, it's become more and more popular with the office staff. So they've started liking it more and started playing it on all sorts of skills, including builds it wasn't expected to perform super well on. So that's something that'll be interesting, and I'm looking forward to when Path of Exile 2's beta comes around so that I can actually test that out for myself. The second interesting point is that Grinding Gear Games have been doing what they term first-time user experience testing, where they've been finding people who are willing to test the game for them under a non-disclosure agreement, and these are often people who have never played Path of Exile 1. There may be people who've played other ARPGs, so they've played one of the Diablo franchise, maybe they've played Torchlight or Last Epoch, and Grinding Gear Games pay them to get their opinions on the way the game is at the moment. But they take a pretty hands-off approach, so it's not like, okay, here's the exact way that we want you to play the game. Instead, they just let them do their own thing and pay attention to the mistakes they make. One of the consequences of this, for instance, was that they found that a lot of these newer players, including Jonathan Rogers' wife, who was doing this testing herself, one of the common mistakes they were making was having life flasks available, but walking around still on low health between packs because they didn't realize that they were on low health. So they fixed that up by adding more visual and audio cues that your character is on low health. Anyways, this first time user experience is something that they've been testing extensively, and they had some interesting experiments where they tested what was the takeaway if they made certain bosses harder than they thought was originally going to be fun. And they actually had fairly positive results from this, and it led to Jonathan posing a little bit of a thought experiment, which was, if dying to Hillock wasn't as miserable an experience as it is in Path of Exile 1, how many times do you think a brand new player should die to Hillock? Anyways, all that discussion of first time user experience testing was really interesting, and it was something that really got me thinking about how difficult bosses should be, and also how often mistakes that players make aren't necessarily the ones that you think they're going to make. The second 10-minute block of the interview started talking a lot about complexity creep and how Path of Exile 1 has grown over time, and Jonathan distilled it down to another really interesting question that wasn't really answered here but was worth thinking about. And that was, if Path of Exile 1 came out today in its present state, after no one had ever played it before, how complex would people think it is, and how different would the meta be to what's developed at the moment? No answers were really given to that. It was something that was a bit of an interesting thought experiment. Jonathan mentioned that he thought things would be quite different to how they've developed as it is, and that's something that I thought was a really interesting takeaway point from that video. The second thing is that they talked about how, with Path of Exile 1 content, actually adapting that for Path of Exile 2 is relatively easy for them. And that's because a lot of the core design elements have been nailed already, and so porting the rest over is a lot less work than you might expect. For instance, they're pretty confident that they could port in Delve, the entirety of the Delve mines, in something that's quite recognizable to its Path of Exile 1 format, and do so very, very quickly into Path of Exile 2. This is not going to be some massive expenditure of developer resources to do that. In the third block of 10 minutes, Jonathan starts talking about how their goal for Path of Exile 1 is that it still feels like Path of Exile 1, but at the same time, if a change is made for Path of Exile 2 and it makes sense in Path of Exile 1, it will be considered for backporting. It's just not guaranteed, and they're quite happy for the games to have a different feel to each other. Finally, two of the things I've learnt from ExileCon, they felt that they had gone too all in on specialising their characters towards being super slow, at least in the case of the character that was slowest. So the two-handed character was the slowest build amongst two-handed characters. It was using a channeled slam, and it was also using a two-handed mace, which are the slowest attacking weapons in Path of Exile 2. So I feel that that was a bit of a mistake they made when they did their presentations at ExileCon 2. And they're very happy with the state that the Huntress was in, at ExileCon 2. Now I wasn't at ExileCon 2, so I can't talk to the experience of playing the Huntress, but it did seem like most of the complaints were about the other classes that were available. The fourth block of 10 minutes mostly fleshed out some of those things that came up from the first time user experience testing. The fifth block of 10 minutes had a couple of really interesting questions. Firstly, Preach asked the question, what are you most proud of in Path of Exile 2? And Jonathan's answer was boss design. He said he really likes boss design in Path of Exile 1 as well, but only the bosses that are deep into the game. And the bosses that are much earlier in the game are generally much less interesting than those later in the game. Path of Exile 2, their goal has been to use some of the things they've learnt developing bosses like the Black Star, and to put that tech earlier in the game. Next, there was a fair bit of discussion of the question of respecking characters, and Jonathan pointed out that there's a whole bunch of things beyond just regret orbs that are friction involved in respecking a character in Path of Exile 1. So, in Path of Exile 1, it's not just the case that you might need to change 40 nodes on your passive tree, and therefore that requires 40 orbs of regret. On top of that, you may need to recolor a chess piece, you need to level new gems, you need to get quality on new gems, and a whole bunch of other related things, like you might need to change auras, you might need to change around the amount of reservation efficiency on your character, all sorts of little tweaks like this that result in there being a fair bit of friction, and Orbs of Regret are a part of that. Path of Exile 2 is trying to roll all of this, or as much of this as possible, into the gold cost. The goal of this is that respecking a character at level 60 should not be an overwhelming cost, but should be non-trivial, and that the cost of respecking a character at level 90, that could be considerably higher. Finally, in the last 10 minutes of the interview, there were a couple of additional questions that were asked that were worth discussing. One of these is something that I felt we already knew the answer to, and that was Grinding Gear Games' attitude to having some sort of campaign skipping or campaign acceleration on alternate characters. And their position on this is basically that it hasn't really changed. They're not interested in having a campaign skip option in the game. I do think Last Epoch gets this right. Last Epoch has a number of dungeons that you can access that you can only realistically get access to when you're way too high in level for the skip to be useful. All of these dungeons have bind to account on acquire access keys that you can only realistically acquire when you're quite a bit further in the game than you would want to be when you're going to do these dungeons. So they don't help you at all on a first character, but they'll propel you forward quite a long way through the storyline if you're capable of doing something far earlier than is intended. I think a Path of Exile equivalent, for those of you that haven't played Last Epoch, would be if after the end of Act 5, you were allowed to attempt the Cruel Labyrinth. And if you succeeded in defeating the Cruel Labyrinth, then you would be able to jump forward in time all the way to the fight with Solaris and Lunaris in Act 8. And because of the way Last Epoch works with skill point quests during the campaign, you don't need to do every single skill point quest in that game, you just need to do a certain number of them. This ends up working out pretty well. So that's the way Last Epoch handles it. I think that would work well in Path of Exile, but Jonathan's answer was no, they don't want to do it. Instead, they want to focus on making the campaign more fun, and also to a lesser extent allowing the bind to account resource gold to be something that you can use to purchase leveling gear on secondary characters. The final question that was asked was Preach talking about how there's a real contrast in Path of Exile between lore delivery being quite slow, mostly through talking to NPCs in town, and at the same time the game pace being fast. So when you've gone and you've killed a whole bunch of gods in Act 6, then you come back to town and suddenly it's like, this has been really, really fast paced. I killed Tukahama, then a few screens later I'm killing Chevron, then a few screens later I'm killing Abarath, then Rizlatha. Now I go back to town for a breather, and there's a whole bunch of dialogue options, but I'm in go fast mode, and so I don't actually get to listen to that, and I don't get to find out about these characters. Jonathan's answer here, unfortunately, was that they haven't been able to solve this problem yet, and they're still looking for solutions there. Anyways, I told you there was a whole bunch of discussion about Path of Exile 2 there. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.